Professor Elliott, thank you for having us here. We're here to have a chat with you about person-centred counselling. If you can tell us a bit about how it came about, what are its origins?
Well, it was developed by Carl Rogers in the 1930s and 40s. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist who was trained fairly conventionally. He found himself working in a child guidance clinic in upstate New York in the United States with troubled children and their families. And he observed that the standard practice was to give these families advice and to interpret, often psychodynamically, the dynamics in the family and going off the child. And his experience was this was not being effective. So he began to develop a therapy which he at first called non-directive because he was giving up the elements of interpreting and giving advice, which were directing the children and their families. So over a period of several years, he developed this so-called non-directive therapy, which was later called client-centered and then person-centered. He then moved to Ohio State around 1940, and that's where he really developed what became known as client-centered therapy. And then he moved again to Chicago and founded the Chicago Counseling Center, where they did groundbreaking research on the therapy and the process of change in the therapy. And eventually, Rogers came up with this very famous formulation of the 6 conditions that bring about client change. And those conditions are briefly that the client is in a state of distress or incongruence. That is to say, there's a kind of mismatch in their experience. And they come into contact with the counselor or therapist so that they are present. They're not in a psychotic condition, in other words. And then the therapist then offers a relationship in which they are trying to understand in an accurate, empathic, deep way what the client is telling the therapist or counselor. The counselor is also warm and accepting and even prizing of the client. And the counselor or therapist is genuine in themselves. They're authentically present. They know what they're experiencing, and they're as transparent as is appropriate to be.
Is that what you would call congruence then?
That's what we call congruence, right, for the therapist. And Rogers' 6th condition was that the client perceive that the therapist is empathic and caring. The client has to see that in order for it to get in, right? And Rogers put this formulation out as basically a kind of theory, which was enormously influential. It influenced therapists in all different orientations. This was published in 1956. He then went on and developed an understanding of how clients change in the therapy, on the process of clients moving from being out of touch with their emotions and kind of rigidly organized in a kind of stuck way, being distant, and to be increasingly more open and fluid and flexible, which he called process. And then what happened was the person-centered approach kind of split somewhere around early 60s. Carl Rogers left academia, went to California, got involved in the encounter group movement, stopped doing research. And there were a group of people who had worked with him in Chicago and Ohio in the 40s and 50s, and those people kind of stayed back with the original formulation of the facilitative conditions, warmth, empathy, genuineness, or congruence. They kind of stayed in that, and they become what we today call the classical or relational person-centered therapists. But there were some other people who picked up on Rogers' work on the client's process, how clients change. And those folks began to look at how they could help clients move from this stuck, kind of rigid position to a more fluid and flexible, open position, more open to their emotions and other kinds of experiences. And those folks became the experiential therapists. And they're folks like Gene Gendlin, who developed an approach called focusing, which involves helping the client to look inside into their body where they feel things and to use that information that's carried in their body to figure out what's going on with them and what to do. So that's one group. That's what we call a tribe. And Another group of us, Les Greenberg, Laura Rice, and I, began developing what became the process experiential approach, or which is also called today the emotion-focused approach. And this happened in the sort of around 1980 through the 80s and the 90s. And we began studying how clients bring problems to the counselor or therapist in a session. Say, for example, the client comes in and they've got, they reacted in some puzzling way to something they couldn't figure out. And they were, they were eating breakfast and their kids were fighting and they got mad and yelled at their kids and then couldn't figure out why they did. That's what we call a problematic reaction point. And we began identifying these things we call markers, which are things the client's doing at a particular moment that says that they're ready to do a kind of work, which is to like figure out why did I did that, and for example. And so we began developing these things and describing, so we looked at how the clients resolved those problems. So we took clients who'd successfully gone through resolving something like a problematic reaction, and then we saw how they did it, and then we figured out how we could help them do it. So this is building on that work that Rogers was doing of the movement from being sort of stuck in kind of rigid structure and out of touch to being more fluid and open. And we identified a group of these markers and different things the therapist could do and to help the client do that. And that became the process experiential approach. Now, there are other approaches too with sort of other tribes within the person-centered nation, we call it. It's our metaphor we like to use. There are also the pre-therapists developed, which came out of the work of Gary Prouty. And Gary Prouty was working with people who are out of touch with reality. They were out of contact. Rogers' second condition was the client had to be in contact with the therapist. And these are folks who are hallucinating in some kind of psychotic condition, they're demented, they're basically not in contact with reality. And this group working with Gary Prouty has developed this wonderful approach, which is fairly close to classical relational person-centered therapy, but it's exquisitely tuned to working with people who are in an immediate psychotic process. And it offers a way to make contact with the client by simply reflecting, what the client is doing. You're nodding your head right now and smiling a little bit. And so the therapist would reflect something like that back to the client. And that would enable the client to come out of their psychotic process and reconnect with the therapist. So that was another one of the tribes. And there are other ones too. We brought in some things from Gestalt therapy. We essentially brought Gestalt into the tribe. So we do a version of Gestalt with chairs and things. And so that's part of it also. So now we have these different tribes in this person-centered nation. Sometimes we have arguments with each other between the classical or relational approach and the more experiential approach. Because the experiential folks do tend to ask questions more. They do tend to suggest the client have a conversation between two parts of the self or look inside or do something. So they make more what we call process suggestions. Whereas a classical person-centered therapist or counselor wouldn't do that. They would reflect back what the person's saying to them. But we're in dialogue with each other and we listen to each other. I have colleagues here that I work with, like Beth Frera, who's very, very classical, and we love watching each other work. And we find it really interesting to do that. So there's a lot of dialogue between us, and I think this is a really good place for us to be in.